my presentation deals with Martin Luther King Jr. and youth activism, exploring intergenerational ties. And so you see on the screen a picture of Dr. King with Floyd McKissick. Floyd McKissick represented, well, he was the chair of Congress of Racial Equality. And in the center, of course, is Dr. King. And to Dr. King's left and your right is Stokely Carmichael, who was chair of SNCC. And so for me, this picture kind of helps to encapsulate Dr. King's relationship with young people. And so I have a question for you, college students. What have you been taught about King's relationship to student activists? Anybody can raise your hand. All right, I see somebody from Grambling. Okay, I'm gonna give you the mic temporarily so they can hear you.
He worked with SCLC and he gave students tasks to do like sit-ins and
Okay. All right. Do you think that he had a good relationship with the students or bad? You think he had a great one? Okay. All right. Good. Good. She says King had a great relationship with students. Thank you very much, Grambling State. Okay. Well, good. Good. And so I'm glad that you said that, because there's some misperception out there about King's relationship with students. King's relationship with students has been misportrayed as strictly oppositional and conflict-ridden. That's only part of the story. And so if we are going to truly understand the movement, we need to have the whole picture. And so since my area of specialization is student activism, I want to make sure that when you come away today that you have a full picture of King's kind of complicated relationship with student activists. And also, part of what my goal is in teaching it this way is I want to encourage my colleagues in the classroom to help, and I'm glad that Dr. Janice and Dr. Allen have done this, but we need to reintroduce students to Dr. King, because I think part of our problem is that some students have come to the conclusion that King is not relevant to their generation. And so I'm pleased at the work that Dr. Janice and Dr. Allen are doing, because they have clearly demonstrated that that's not the case. Okay? And so the goal then would be to engender a new appreciation of Dr. King's legacy. And one of the things that I want for you to have as a takeaway today is the interdependence between King and student activists. And so they actually depended on each other for a most successful outcome. And also, and I think you were doing this, Dr. Allen, is that you are helping students to develop new interpretations of Dr. King's legacy. And that's important, because students today, I believe, they need to take part ownership of this vision that Dr. King articulated in the 60s. Because the reality is that the work is not over. We still have much work to do. And so the work won't be completed unless young people like you in this audience are part of this re-envisioning and reapplication of King's vision to the problems that we still have in the 21st century. And so we're going to depend on you for that. Now, the beginning of King's relationship with students really starts with the sit-in movement. And so on the photograph, you see a Morehouse College student by the name of Lonnie King, and next to him a Spelman student by the name of Marilyn Price. And then, of course, on the far right is Dr. King. And so this is right after a sit-in that took place here in Atlanta at a department store called Rich's, October 19th, 1960. And so this is King's first and only sit-in. Oh, there we go. And so for the sit-ins, one of the things that's important is that King gave the sit-in movement his highest support. Now, you all have a handout that I gave. And so I want you to get your handout. and go to the second page, the front of the second page. And there's a document, and this document is a document that I have my students find in the Morehouse College King Collection. It's called From the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. One of the interesting things about working with primary documents is that you learn something about King that you didn't know. I learned that Dr. King can't spell well all the time. So you see, they said, and sometimes Dr. King can't spell well, and I also noticed that whoever wrote this letter from SNCC, they didn't know how to spell Dr. King's name. They have Martin Luther King Jr. Did you see that? Okay, and it says, this is, the students are writing Dr. King after he was arrested protesting with them. It says, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, speaking for students all over America, reaches across the bars of DeKalb County Jail. And thanks to you for your deep commitment to the concept of I meant to say nonviolence, they said no violence, and your visions of a free society which makes possible this student movement. You sat in with us, you went to jail with us. We want you to know that the fight will not end, for we have taken up the torch for freedom. We will not forget that you are behind iron bars. We ask that you remember us as we try to remove the bars that exist in the hearts of men. Yours in the cause for freedom, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Marion Berry Jr., who was a master's student at Fisk at the time, chairman, and Edward B. King Jr., administrative secretary. And so this is just one example of King giving high support to students in the sit-in movement. King's organization gave $800 to help SNCC get off the ground on his founding conference. And King often always spoke positively about students taking part in the sit-ins. And for his participation in this particular sit-in, King went to state prison at Reedsville. And it was a harrowing and frightening experience for him because King did not like to go to jail. And people did not know what might happen to King in the state prison here in Georgia. Someone could kill him. And so there was a big deal for him to go. And the other thing that shows King's support for the student movement is that King actually saved the Atlanta student movement. There's a panel on the wall over here, that third panel. It talks about the crisis in March of 1961, in which Lonnie King and Herschel Sullivan made a deal with white businessmen that the community did not endorse or support. And it caused a big dust-up. And the Atlanta student movement almost collapsed. But Dr. King made a speech at a local church, not far, actually walking distance from this school, from this library, which held the movement together. And so had it not been for Dr. King urging the community to continue to support the deal that was made, the movement may have collapsed. And so King was very supportive of what the students were doing in their various student movements. And Atlanta is just one example. So that's King's beginning in his relationship with students. The next phase of King's relationship with the student movement has to do with the Freedom Rides. Does anybody know what year the Freedom Rides began? Somebody said 1960. That's close. 61. Who said 61? Where you from? Norfolk State, got it right. Thank you, thank you. So, one of the issues here for King is King's relationship to the Freedom Rides. And so you see King at a press conference with Wyatt Walker, the executive secretary, with his colleague Ralph Abernathy, and also a student by the name of John Lewis, also who eventually went to Fisk, but he was a student at American Baptist Theological Seminary at the time. They're at a press conference talking about continuing the Freedom Rides. And so, the only Freedom Rider in that picture is John Lewis. King, Abernathy, and Walker did not participate in the Freedom Rides, but yet they are representing They are acting in a leadership role in reference to the Freedom Rides, but they're not participants. That's going to be a problem. That other photograph is King talking to a mass meeting in which there's a hostile white mob outside, throwing firebombs at the church, turning over cars, burning cars, and they don't know if they cannot get out of that church. They have to spend the night in that church. This is in Montgomery. So King is the spokesperson for the Freedom Rides, even though he's not participating. And so there's this perception then that King came to Montgomery to take over the Freedom Rides. And so that causes a problem with students who are actual Freedom Riders. The other issue is King was asked by Diane Nash, who was also a Fish student, if he would join the Freedom Rides, and King refused. Well, why do you imagine he might refuse? Would you want to get on a bus and take a chance of getting killed? Because y'all know about the bus that got burned in Anniston, right? High chance of getting killed. King felt like he was more valuable as a spokesperson and a fundraiser for his organization and the movement than going on a Freedom Ride. So he refused to go. And in fact, that's King, that other photograph on the right, that's King seeing the Freedom Riders off after he had already told them that I should choose the time and place of my own Golgotha. So you biblical scholars, what is that reference to Golgotha? Does anybody know what that means? Somebody in the back? You want to yell it out? Stand up, sir. Yeah, that's where Christ was crucified. Thank you, sir. Where are you from? Tennessee State. Thank you. So students were a little irked that King would take such a high and lofty position, almost comparing himself to Jesus Christ. And so you can understand how this would create some tension between King and activists involved in the Freedom Rides. So the Freedom Rides become a place where you begin to see some tensions emerge between student activists and Dr. King. Now, things will get a bit more tense. That's later in the same year, 1961, in Albany, Georgia. Freedom Rides will come to Albany, Georgia, and you will have people like Charles Sherrod, and Cordell Reagan is the third from the left. He and Sherrod went to Albany and helped to jumpstart that movement off. And then you have James Foreman, who was Executive Secretary of SNCC at the time. Those three men will be a problem for King. They will be the main students in Albany who are, you could say, anti-King. And so the movement has to make a decision about whether or not to bring Dr. King to Albany because their movement has stalled. And this is December of 1961. SNCC doesn't want King to come, but the local people want King to come. King will bring a lot of publicity and put pressure on local officials. So the local people think it'll be a good idea to bring King. SNCC doesn't want King to come. And this is really a case of two organizing styles. So King and the SCLC do what we call mass mobilizing. That is, you come in, stay maybe a couple of weeks, you can get a large volume of people to come out and participate in whatever activities you want to host. You'll get the media to come, and it'll be a big national issue, and perhaps you can put pressure on local officials to make the changes that you want. So that's the sort of the approach that SCLC used. SNCC didn't use that approach. They used a grassroots organizing approach where you embed yourself into a local community, you stay for the long term, you build up local leadership, and you don't depend upon a charismatic leader like King to draw a large crowd and a lot of press and other kind of interests. And so there's a conflict in organizing styles that creates more tension between SNCC and King, and it leads to a big public dust-up. And largely because of King's refusal to go on the freedom rides earlier in 1961, SNCC begins to derisively refer to King as the Lord. There goes the Lord. And so that's how they used to refer to King, sometimes to his face and sometimes not. So you see, King really has a problem with SNCC now. And one of the things that King did to resolve this problem was to hire young people. So he hired James Bevel as the first field organizer. John Lewis joined the board of SNCC, of Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And Bernard Lafayette came on board, another student in Nashville came on board later. Okay? And SNCC was even so upset with King that they actually tried to sabotage the negotiations just in order to get King out of town. So you see, you got a lot of tension here in reference to King. Now, King's most important relationship to a student activist involves Stokely Carmichael. And this photograph here is from June of 1966, and it's on a march called March Against Fear that was started by James Meredith, who integrated University of Mississippi in 1962. So in 1966, Meredith decided that he would go on a solo one-man March Against Fear, marching from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi by himself. And on the second day of the march, he got shot. And so all the civil rights leaders came to Memphis, including King, Stokely Carmichael, Cleveland Sellers, also from SNCC, Stanley Wise from SNCC, and then the gentleman on the far right, Willie Mukasa Dada Ricks, who was here in the Atlanta University Center. They all came to Memphis. And so you see King with those other activists, and Bernard Lee was a student who joined the SCLC staff and became King's personal assistant. And so when you look at that photograph, what do you see? Do you see a King that looks like he's upset with students or doesn't know how to get along with young people? They're all in a very happy mood, right? So this photograph shows that King and student activists, the ones who got a chance to know Dr. King, came to appreciate him. And no one articulated that better than Stokely Carmichael. And so this quote to your left says, and this is Stokely Carmichael in his autobiography, Ready for Revolution. He said about his relationship with King. He said, "At my most important, potentially confusing, and formative stage, Dr. King was a true mentor who instructed me by example." So now Carmichael is using Dr. King because he knows that King will attract media attention on a national scale. So he strategically decided to launch Black Power on this march because Dr. King is there. And so you can almost draw a conclusion that there would not have been the same kind of impact, perhaps, unless Dr. King was there. And we don't know exactly what they would have been like, but Carmichael clearly understood that he needed King in order for what he was trying to do to have his maximum impact. And so he needed King in that respect. Carmichael also needed King as a mentor. King schooled Carmichael in terms of how to handle himself as a public figure who was the head of an important student organization. And so he mentored him in that way. Now, it may be surprising, but King also needed Carmichael. So this is 1966. Vietnam is a war that's going strong, and there's a lot beginning to see some protests against the Vietnam War. And so Carmichael, at the same time, is urging King to take a public stand against the war. He's saying that King is the only person who has the moral authority to make the nation pay attention. SNCC had already denounced the war, but people ignored them. He said, King, they cannot dismiss you like they can dismiss SNCC. And so what Carmichael is doing for King is to help embolden King to take a stand that he needs to take. And so without Carmichael, we don't know exactly when King may have decided to go public with his stance against Vietnam. But Carmichael is a key part of helping King realize that the timing is right for him to stand out and say no to the injustice of Vietnam. And so there's this mutual dependency between Carmichael and King. They need each other. And my research has indicated to me that the movements that had this kind of intergenerational interplay were the most successful movements. And so going back to the example of Atlanta, King was an important part of the glue that ultimately held that movement together. Otherwise, it may possibly have disintegrated. And then the advance of a movement to a new stage in terms of Black power, Carmichael understood that King was necessary in terms of debuting something that he thought was an important development for the next stage of the movement. So King and his relationship to students is very, very important part of the whole process of the movement. And students began to re-examine their impression of King as a result of how they got to know King on this march in 1966. So King was able to bond with Carmichael and with SNCC as a result of the Meredith March. And then to kind of wrap it up and to conclude, my approach to teaching about any historical figure is that we should make heroes out of historical figures. And so I think it helps us when we teach students to humanize King and not treat him as a hero, because that sets people up for disappointment, because all people have flaws. And so for me, it's just better to humanize King. And so I chose that photograph because I want to show King in terms of his family life. And so there he is with two of his children, Yolanda and Martin, his two oldest children. And King is one of the most important forces in building an intergenerational kind of movement. And there was probably not another adult leader who did that better than Martin Luther King Jr. And as we have seen, King's relationship with student activists is complicated, is complex. And some of it is distortion by the media. And the media tried to play King against the students, but King was wise enough not to fall into that trap. And so he never condemned Carmichael and SNCC for Black power, but he told them what he thought the flaws were. And so when you look at King's relationship with students, some like him, some dislike him. Many respect and love him, some resent him for his fame, some supported him, and some disagreed with him in terms of his philosophy, his ideological philosophy, his strategy, and his tactics. And so Stokely Carmichael was one of those who both loved and admired King, but also they had their disagreements. And so when we understand it, that it's not one way or the other, it's not all disagreement, but it's also agreement and then sometimes disagreement, then I think we end up with a better and a more balanced approach to understanding King's relationship with the students, and then we have a more accurate portrayal of the life and legacy of Dr. King. Thank you.